On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was struck down in broad daylight in Dallas, Texas, turning jubilation to chaos. Within minutes, the president was rushed to Parkland Memorial Hospital. Doctors fought desperately to save him, but at 1 p.m., their efforts ended. The president was pronounced dead. Yet even before the nation could grieve, a new battle began. Not over who fired the shots, but over who would control the body. Texas law required an autopsy in Dallas. Instead, federal agents intervened. The president's remains were taken by force, flown to Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland. There, the official autopsy would unfold. But what happened that night has never been fully resolved. The president's body told two different stories. The official records describe one set of wounds. The doctors at Parkland remember another. Despite decades of investigations, hearings, and declassified files at the heart of the Kennedy assassination, the most basic questions remain unanswered. Where exactly was the fatal head wound? What path did the bullets truly take? And most importantly, what really happened at Bethesda on the night of November 22, 1963?
Just near the presidential jet to take the coffin away.
The men are now struggling with the casket. It appears to be the casket, struggling to get it out of the plane.
As Air Force One touched down at Andrews Air Force Base in Washington, D.C. at 6 p.m., America entered a new chapter, not just of leadership, but of questions. The body of President Kennedy had traveled 1,300 miles, but the truth, many argue, never made the journey. Inside the plane, a grieving widow, a new president, and a body shrouded in mystery. The bronze ceremonial casket seen by millions on live television was lowered onto the tarmac. It would be taken, visibly, to Bethesda Naval Hospital. But what happened between Air Force One and the autopsy room is a story riddled with contradictions.
It's a bright, shiny casket glistening in the lights here at the airport.
Casket is a dark brown in color, slightly reddish.
The body was transported to Bethesda Naval Hospital. The official report marks the autopsy as beginning at 8 p.m., but curiously, it makes no mention of one crucial detail, the arrival of the bronze casket. According to the official record, everything was straightforward. The casket arrived intact that evening, just as it had left Dallas. But according to multiple witnesses, military, medical, and mortuary, that's not the whole story. Some Bethesda personnel claim JFK's body arrived well before the bronze casket, that it came in a different container entirely, a cheap gray shipping casket, and not accompanied by Jackie Kennedy, but by plainclothes agents.
At about 6:30 p.m., Mr. David said he received a telephone call in which someone said, "Your visitor is on his way. You will need some people to offload." He then got his own duty sailors together, borrowed some more from the dental school, and assembled them outside the morgue at the loading dock by about 6:40 p.m. 5 or 6 minutes later, at about 6:45, he said a black hearse drove up at the morgue loading dock. 4 or 5 men in blue suits, whom he assumed were federal agents, exited the back of the hearse and supervised and observed while the Navy sailors, approximately 7 or 8 people, working for him, offloaded the casket which was in the hearse. He said it was a simple gray shipping casket such as he frequently saw used later during the Vietnam War. At approximately 1700 hours, 22nd November, a detail of 10 men were sent to Bethesda Naval Hospital with orders to report to Admiral Galloway. The detail arrived at the hospital at approximately 1800, and after reporting as ordered, several members of the detail were posted at entrances to prevent unauthorized persons from entering the prescribed area. At approximately 1835, the casket was received at the morgue entrance and taken inside. On Friday, November 22nd, 1963, Reed received a call to bring the portable machine to the morgue. Reed became involved because he just happened to be pulling duty. Reed stated that he arrived at the morgue around 6:30. Reed was present in the morgue when President Kennedy's body arrived, and he helped carry the body into the morgue. Reed said that approximately 25 people were present.
Others recall the president's body already unwrapped, partially undressed, with signs that some wounds may have been altered.
The morgue door burst open and 6 or 7 men came carrying this casket in and set it on the floor next to the autopsy table. As I remember, this casket was a type of casket that was a cheap shipping type of casket. What I mean by shipping casket is that it's not a very ornamental casket. It's not very expensive. It's a very plain casket. The casket was opened, and inside was a slate gray rubber body bag with a zipper that ran from the head all the way down to the toes. It's the kind of body bag that you find people that were carried out of a disaster in. They unzipped the body bag, and inside was the body of the president. We put the body on the table. He was nude, no clothes on, but he had a white sheet, bloody white sheet wrapped around his face and his head.
If true, this detail shatters the official timeline. It suggests that the president's body may have been separated from the ceremonial casket and perhaps even altered before the formal autopsy began. 2 arrivals, 2 timelines, 2 conflicting truths, and just 1 official autopsy. The broken chain of custody raised immediate questions. Was the body tampered with before the autopsy began? Were wounds modified intentionally or otherwise? And if so, why? The Warren Commission would later dismiss these discrepancies as misremembered details. Fog of war, fog of trauma. But to critics, the inconsistencies weren't just errors, they were red flags. From the Bethesda staff to the morticians, stories diverged wildly. Timelines didn't line up, details didn't match.
Would you mind us going through the timeline of what happened from the moment they found out he's dead to the moment, because that's where the challenge is with this story, right? I mean, you did the autopsy stuff, but the challenge for me when I look at it, I'm a numbers guy. So first they find out he's dead. Boom, check mark. Then they say, let's put his body, they wrap him up in they put him in a really nice casket. They take him to Air Force One. That's number 2. Lyndon Johnson's waiting there rather than going back to DC to have the body being delivered to the plane, which is kind of a little bit wild for that. Gets to Air Force One. Then they fly back to Bethesda, DC. They land, they take that nice casket and they put it in the automobile that Jackie Kennedy is riding in to go to where you're at, the morgue. They arrive actually at 7:30, but the body doesn't come in 7:17. And the body doesn't come until 8. And the challenge that I'm seeing there is another automobile delivers a casket that's used for Vietnam veterans back in the day. It's just a cheapy type of casket that apparently they took John F. Kennedy and they put him in a body bag and they put him there. And that was brought to you guys at around 6:30, and you had an hour and a half before 8 o'clock. So that's the part that's conflicting here.
See, and again, too, I really don't have any insight into that either.
But the report, you read the Bourgeon report and all of that, the numbers, him and Dennis David's timing.
And see, and I had to have a timeline for this as I was writing it. I had no personal timeline because, all I saw was the body being brought in what I considered to be a shipping casket. That was striking, and the fact is that it was the president's body in that such a ordinary plane.
You saw that?
Yes, I did.
You saw the shipping casket?
Yes, I did.
When I saw the autopsy pictures, I thought somebody had really tampered with the whole thing, and it made me very suspicious because it didn't look anything like what I saw there, and they had also completely sewed up the temporal parietal side of his head, and it was closed. And I said, why would they do that?
The cerebellum was not protruding. We examined the cerebellum photographically, and it was intact.
Maybe the left lobe was, but the right lobe had fallen out. I saw that.
He's wrong. There was no gaping hole, and there was no cerebellum that fell out on the car, period.
In any criminal investigation, the integrity of evidence is sacred. Break that chain, and trust shatters with it. By the time John F. Kennedy's autopsy officially began, the chain was already broken. No one could say for certain how the body had arrived or what had already been done to it. And yet, this flawed, uncertain examination would become the bedrock of the official record. 3 men stood over the president's body that night. Commander James Humes, Commander J. Thornton Boswell, and Lieutenant Colonel Pierre Fink. All were respected military pathologists, but only one, Fink, had any background in the forensics of gunshot wounds. Even then, his experience was limited.
Doctor, I believe you stated you were one of the co-authors of the autopsy report. Is that correct?
I stated that I was one of the 3 authors of the autopsy report.
Now, during the autopsy, Colonel, and the results of the autopsy, were there any disagreements between you and Commander Boswell and Commander Humes as to what was done and the results thereof?
No.
Am I correct in stating, Colonel, that you agreed, as the other 2 commanders agreed with you, as to the results and what was done and how it was done at the autopsy? Is that correct, sir?
And how it should be reported.
Yes, sir, right. Now, Doctor, have you ever conducted any experiments or research on the effects of a missile penetration of the brain or the skull?
I did not. However, if I may say something, I have carried out experiments to study the effect of a bullet striking bone and also the effects of a bullet going through or striking a gelatin block.
Well, am I correct in saying you did not have any experiments or research in the area of a missile penetrating the brain and skull? Is that correct? Did you not tell the Warren Commission that when you were asked by them, sir?
This is correct, but I would like to say at this time that I have carried out experiments after my testimony before the Warren Commission.
At the time of the autopsy, Dr. Fink had no prior experience with missile penetration of the brain or skull. He had studied how bullets shattered bone and tore through soft tissue, but those were controlled experiments. This was completely different. Humes and Boswell were hospital men, skilled at medicine but not homicide. They walked into the autopsy room without the essential tools of a criminal investigation. No trajectory rods, no forensic-grade cameras, no chain of custody protocols. Instead, they leaned on what others in the room told them had happened. And when the evidence raised uncomfortable questions, they didn't press, they didn't challenge, because in that room, the doctors weren't in charge.
You were a co-author of the report, though, weren't you, Doctor?
Wait, I was called as a consultant to look at these wounds. That doesn't mean I am running the show.
Was Dr. Humes running the show?
Well, I heard Dr. Humes stating that. He said, "Who is in charge here?" And I heard an Army general, I don't remember his name, stating, "I am." You must understand that in those circumstances, there were law enforcement officers, military people with various ranks, and you have to coordinate the operation according to directions.
But you were one of the 3 qualified pathologists standing at that autopsy table, were you not, Doctor?
Yes, I was.
Was this Army general a qualified pathologist?
No.
Was he a doctor?
No, not to my knowledge.
Can you give me his name, Colonel?
No, I can't. I don't remember.
How many other military personnel were present at the autopsy in the autopsy room?
That autopsy room was quite crowded. It is a small autopsy room, and when you are called in circumstances like that to look at the wound of the President of the United States who is dead, you don't look around too much to ask people for their names and take notes on who they are and how many there are. I did not do so. The room was crowded with military and civilian personnel and federal agents, Secret Service agents, FBI agents for part of the autopsy, but I cannot give you a precise breakdown as regards the attendance of the people in that autopsy room at Bethesda Naval Hospital.
Colonel, did you feel that you had to take orders from this Army general that was there directing the autopsy?
No, because there were others. There were admirals.
There were admirals?
Oh yes, there were admirals. And when you are a lieutenant colonel in the Army, you just follow orders. And at the end of the autopsy, we were specifically told, as I recall it, it was by Admiral Kenny, the Surgeon General of the Navy, This is subject to verification. We were specifically told not to discuss the case.
You were told not to discuss the case?
To discuss the case without coordination with the Attorney General.
The doctors may have been holding the instruments, but they weren't holding the authority. In that room, the chain of command didn't lead to medicine, it led to the military. And the most critical autopsy of the 20th century was carried out under orders, not science. The only forensic pathologist in the room, Dr. Pierre Fink, wasn't even there from the start. He was rushed in, mid-procedure. By the time he arrived, the autopsy was already halfway through. JFK's body had been cut open, not by experts in gunshot wounds, but by doctors with no forensic training. Now, standing at the table, Fink was unsettled by what he saw, but what unsettled him even more was what he was not allowed to do. Years later, under oath, he revealed that when he asked permission to trace the bullet's path from Kennedy's back, the response was cold and direct. Just one word. No. No explanation, no debate, just a command. And with it, the truth was stopped in its tracks.
I believe you told Mr. Diamond, Colonel, the reason you did not dissect the track of the bullet through the throat was because you did not want to mutilate the body of the president. Is that correct?
I did not consider this dissection.
Did you or did you not tell Mr. Diamond a few moments ago that you did not dissect the track of the president's throat because of the mutilation of the body that would result?
Yes, I did say that.
And you also told me yesterday you were told not to go into the throat area?
Yes, I don't remember the details about this. Who said what?
You were told?
From what I remember.
And you did not do it?
We did not remove the organs of the neck, obviously.
Describe to me what you did with the body in autopsy. What did you do with the body and how did you perform this autopsy?
Please repeat your question. I did not hear it.
Will you describe for me what incisions you made into the body of the president?
I did not make the incisions into the body. As I recall, I was called to examine the wound and the incisions were made by the other two pathologists who performed the autopsy, Dr. Humes and Dr. Boswell, and who signed this autopsy report. My role in this autopsy was to emphasize the wounds, to examine the wounds. That is why I was called.
Let that sink in. The one man in the room with the training to trace a bullet's path was told he couldn't. The very procedure that could have settled history was forbidden. And when you look around that room, it becomes clear why. No other forensic pathologists, no ballistics experts, no independent witnesses. Instead, rows of uniforms, high-ranking officers, unnamed federal agents, men who issued orders, men who overruled doctors. It was less an autopsy and more a chain of command. Instructions were handed down. Questions met with silence. Normal procedures abandoned. Then came one of the most astonishing decisions of the night. The doctors never dissected the wound in Kennedy's back. Why? Because they were told the bullet had exited through the throat. No dissection, no confirmation. They simply accepted the explanation without proof and moved on. It is clear the doctors weren't running this examination. They were following commands. From whom? No names, no signatures, no paper trail. So, who was truly directing the most consequential autopsy of the 20th century? A medical investigation or a carefully managed narrative? Humes and Boswell said little, but the records show they were working under pressure from the White House, the Kennedy family, and military hierarchy. The result, a hurried, incomplete autopsy that stopped short of fulfilling forensic standards. What the autopsy could have revealed was smothered under silence, supervision, and just enough pressure to make sure no one pushed too far. And so, to this day, the truth about the bullet's path through John F. Kennedy's body remains a question mark, because no one was ever permitted to answer it. Before the autopsy, before the official story began to crystallize, before the narrative was written, there were doctors, real-time witnesses, confronted with a dying president. When President Kennedy was rushed into Trauma Room 1 at Parkland Memorial Hospital, the doctors weren't looking for mysteries. They were looking for ways to keep him alive. In the chaos, one detail stood out immediately. a small, circular wound in his throat just beneath the Adam's apple. Dr. Charles Carrico, the first physician to reach the president, later described it as a small, neat wound, not gaping, not jagged, just a precise puncture in the middle of the throat. It didn't resemble the ragged damage exit wounds often leave behind.
Will you describe as specifically as you can then the neck wounds, which you heretofore mentioned briefly?
There was a small wound, 5 to 8 millimeters in size, located in the lower third of the neck, just below the thyroid cartilage, the Adam's apple.
Will you show us about where it was?
Just about where your tie would be.
Where did it enter?
It entered?
Yes.
At the time, we did not know the entrance. All we knew was that this was a small wound here.
I see. And you put your hand right above where your tie is?
Yes, sir. Just where the tie...
A little bit to the left?
To the right.
Yes. To the right?
Yes. And this wound was fairly round, had no jagged edges, no evidence of powder burns, and so forth.
Moments later, Dr. Malcolm Perry, the attending surgeon, cut directly through the wound to perform an emergency tracheotomy. Even in that hurried procedure, he said the wound appeared to be an entrance wound. For him, this looked like a bullet entering the body. Dr. Robert McClellan, standing beside Perry, agreed. In his memory, the wound appeared like a bullet hole coming in. But several hours later, when the body arrived in Maryland, the picture began to shift. At Bethesda, the autopsy doctors did not describe the throat injury as a clean bullet wound at all. By the time they saw it, the incision had been cut open during Perry's tracheotomy. What they found then was a surgically altered hole, too modified, they argued, to make firm judgments about its original nature. They chose instead to place it within a broader trajectory, matching it to a shallow wound discovered in Kennedy's back. From there, the story crystallized. The bullet entered Kennedy's back, passed through the body, and exited at the throat. The neat hole described in Dallas was no longer an entrance wound. It became officially an exit wound. The difference is more than medical semantics. In Dallas, 3 doctors independently described a wound that looked like an entry point. In Bethesda, the same wound was reclassified as an exit point. It is a subtle shift, but it had massive consequences. Because once the throat wound was accepted as an exit, it helped construct the framework of the single bullet theory, the idea that one projectile struck both President Kennedy and Governor Connally, causing multiple injuries with a single shot. The throat wound became a pivot point. To the doctors in Dallas, it suggested a shot from the front. To the autopsy in Bethesda, it became proof of a shot from behind. At Parkland, the doctors never saw a back wound. Kennedy was rushed in, still alive, but fading fast. His clothes were never fully removed. Their focus was singular, saving a life, not examining a body. And so, in Dallas, no testimony was ever given about a bullet wound in the back. But in Bethesda, hours later, that back wound became central to the autopsy. The official report described it in clinical terms. The bullet entered the upper right posterior thorax just below the shoulder blade. Here's where the controversy begins. When the pathologists probed the wound, they found it was shallow, only about 2 inches deep. Not the devastating channel you'd expect from a high-velocity rifle round. The track ended abruptly, with no exit, as if the bullet had simply disappeared inside the body. 2 FBI agents in the autopsy room that night, Francis O'Neill and James Seibert, later wrote their own report. In it, they described the same problem. The wound was too shallow to have passed through. They even recalled the doctors pausing, puzzled, remarking aloud that the track didn't extend far enough to reach the throat.
This opening was probed by Dr. Humes with the finger, at which time it was determined that the trajectory of the missile entering at this point had entered at a downward position of 45 to 60 degrees. Further probing determined that the distance traveled by this missile was a short distance, inasmuch as the end of the opening could be felt with the finger.
To O'Neill and Seibert, the most logical explanation was simple. The bullet had either lodged inside the body or worked its way out during the frantic efforts at Parkland. But that left a problem. A bullet that entered but never exited and was never recovered raised one haunting question. Where did it go? The official conclusion, written later, was tidy enough. The bullet had passed clean through, exiting at the throat. Yet, in the moment inside the autopsy room, the evidence refused to cooperate. This wasn't just Dallas versus Bethesda. It was a conflict within Bethesda itself. A shallow wound, no bullet, no clear track, and no convincing explanation. and still the final report stitched the pieces together, declaring the back wound and the throat wound as one continuous path. A neat solution that propped up the single bullet theory.
It's that second bullet, the trajectory of it, and all the damage they said it did that made Dr. Wecht so skeptical. He called it the magic bullet. He says the bullet's path just doesn't make sense.
At Parkland Memorial Hospital, the head wound was the most unforgettable and shocking injury the doctors encountered. Those who worked on Kennedy described it in vivid, near-unanimous terms, a massive blowout wound at the back of the head extending into the right rear. Dr. Robert McClelland later testified bluntly, the back of the head was gone.
I was in such a position that I could very closely examine the head wound, and I noted that the right posterior portion of the skull had been extremely blasted. It had been shattered apparently by the force of the shot, so that cerebellar tissue had extruded.
Dr. Kemp Clark, the neurosurgeon on duty, detailed a large occipital parietal defect, damage to the rear portion of the skull. To him, the injury suggested that a bullet might have entered from the front, tearing outward and leaving the back devastated.
I had observed a large hole in the back of the president's head, and that the back of the head was blown out. In my opinion, the wound was an exit wound.
Several doctors recalled seeing what they believed was cerebellar tissue, brain matter located at the rear of the brain, extruding from the wound. For them, this reinforced the impression that the trauma had been to the back of the skull.
There was a large defect in the back side of the head as the president lay on the cart with what appeared to be some brain hanging out of this wound. There was a great laceration on the right side of the head, causing a great defect in the skull plate, so that there was herniation and laceration of great areas of the brain, even to the extent that the cerebellum had protruded from the wound. The back of the right occipital parietal portion of his head was shattered, with brain substance extruding. We had an opportunity to look at his head wound then and saw that the damage was beyond hope. That is, in a word, literally the right side of his head had been blown off. With this and the observation that the cerebellum was present, a large quantity of brain was present on the cart. It seemed that from the vortex to the left ear, and from the brow line to the occiput on the left-hand side of the head, the cranium was entirely missing. I walked to the president's head to get a closer look. His entire right cerebral hemisphere appeared to be gone. It looked like a crater, an empty cavity. All I could see there was mangled, bloody tissue.
These observations were immediate, raw, and unfiltered. They were not tempered by reports, diagrams, or theory. They were made in the chaos of the trauma room, under the pressure of trying to save a life slipping away despite their best efforts. At the autopsy in Bethesda, the description of the head wound shifted dramatically. The official report identified a large defect not in the rear, as Parkland doctors had described, but in the top right and frontal region of the skull. The parietal bone, extending forward into the frontal bone, was recorded as the primary area of damage. The official conclusion, this wound was consistent with a shot from behind and above, the trajectory pointing toward the Texas School Book Depository. Photographs taken during the autopsy, which would later become the subject of intense scrutiny and controversy, appeared to show the back of the head intact. This directly contradicted the vivid accounts from Dallas, where multiple doctors had described a massive blowout at the rear of the skull. This resulted in one of the most striking contradictions in the entire case. In Dallas, Parkland doctors insisted they saw a catastrophic wound in the rear of the head, raising the possibility of a shot from the front. In Bethesda, the official autopsy emphasized a top right front wound, reinforcing the conclusion of a shot from behind. Two sets of doctors, two radically different wounds, one body. At Parkland, the doctors saw one story. At Bethesda, the autopsy told another. The same body produced two entirely different medical records. And that raises the question, were these contradictions the result of confusion in the chaos, or the deliberate shaping of a narrative? If the wounds were described so differently, what else in the record might have been altered, obscured, or lost? The answers lie not just in the wounds themselves, but in the evidence that would later go missing. A week after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, a grieving nation looked to its leaders for answers. Instead of clarity, what they received was the Warren Commission. Formed by President Lyndon B. Johnson, the commission carried a monumental task: to investigate, evaluate, and report the facts relating to the death of the president. It bore the name of its chairman, Chief Justice Earl Warren, the highest judicial authority in the land. But seated alongside him were not neutral outsiders. They were some of the most powerful men in Washington, men with long histories inside the very institutions that might themselves come under scrutiny. Allen Dulles, the former director of Central Intelligence, fired by Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs fiasco. John McCloy, a figure so deeply woven into government and intelligence circles that some called him the chairman of the establishment. And senators and congressmen whose loyalties extended not only to the public but to the political machinery of Washington itself. On paper, their mission was impartial and independent. But was it truly? Or was the outcome shaped from its very formation by men who had both the motive and the means to control the truth? From the very start, the Warren Commission's work rested on shaky ground. At the heart of its investigation was the Bethesda Autopsy, a report already clouded with contradictions and unanswered questions. Yet, rather than scrutinize its flaws, the commission leaned on it as the foundation of its case. No independent forensic pathologist was ever brought in to examine the evidence. This meant the only medical analysis available was the same one carried out under military supervision at Bethesda. An autopsy, we now know, was incomplete and inconsistent. Equally troubling, the doctors who treated President Kennedy in Dallas, the very first witnesses to his wounds, were never invited to testify in person. Their impressions were filtered through summaries and affidavits, which downplayed or omitted the conflict with the official autopsy. Conflicting wound descriptions from the location of the back wound to the direction of the throat wound were brushed aside, not resolved. Each one should have set off alarms. Instead, they were dismissed, treated as an inconvenience, which leaves the obvious questions hanging in the air. Why was the autopsy never independently reviewed? Why was the first-hand testimony of the Dallas doctors silenced? And if the commission's true mission was truth, why did it begin by turning its back on the clearest evidence? At the center of the Warren Commission's case lies what became its most controversial claim: the single bullet theory. Without it, the lone gunman narrative collapses. With it, every contradiction has to be bent into alignment. The theory, crafted by Commission lawyer Arlen Specter, proposed a nearly impossible trajectory. According to his version, one bullet entered President Kennedy's back, exited through his throat, then struck Governor Connally in front of him, shattering a rib, smashing through his wrist, and finally lodging in his thigh. And yet, despite this extraordinary journey, the bullet, Commission Exhibit 399, was found in near pristine condition, barely flattened, virtually undamaged. A bullet that supposedly tore through two men, breaking bones along the way, looked as if it had been dropped on the floor. This is where the questions grow louder. Does the physical condition of this bullet truly match the violent path it's alleged to have taken? Or was the evidence massaged, molded, and even ignored to preserve the lone gunman's story? Because without the magic bullet, the timeline doesn't work. And if the timeline doesn't work, neither does the Commission's conclusion.
I couldn't quite understand why a bullet going through the president's neck, coming from the right and above, exiting out through his throat, would then zig and zag to strike the governor who was sitting directly in front of the president. It would seem to me that that bullet would have struck the governor in the left side of his chest rather than the right side of his chest.
The Warren Commission presented its report as the definitive account of Kennedy's death. But beneath the polished conclusions, dissenting voices were quietly minimized or erased altogether. Doctors at Parkland Hospital who fought to save the president's life consistently described a large wound to the rear of Kennedy's head, a description that suggested a shot from the front, not the rear, where Lee Harvey Oswald was said to be. Yet these accounts barely appear in the final report. The medical evidence itself was no less troubling. X-rays and autopsy photographs taken at Bethesda didn't seem to match what witnesses remembered seeing with their own eyes. Instead of grappling with these discrepancies, the Commission leaned on the official autopsy record, a record already riddled with contradictions. Even within the process, concerns were reportedly softened or reframed. Staff members who raised doubts about testimony or evidence found their objections sidelined, rewritten, or simply omitted. So the question remains, what exactly was left out of the final report? And perhaps more importantly, who had the authority to decide which evidence was credible and which would never see the light of day? In September 1964, the Warren Commission delivered their verdict. Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. He fired 3 shots from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. There was no conspiracy, foreign or domestic. Case closed. For the government, the report wasn't just an investigation. It was a stabilizing tool, a way to assure the public that the nation's leader had not fallen victim to a larger plot. But in locking the narrative so firmly, the commission also cemented doubt. Many Americans accepted the findings as official history. Yet for others, the omissions, contradictions, and unanswered questions made the report less a beacon of truth and more a symbol of government control. Trust, once shaken, began to erode. The Warren Report was meant to end speculation. Instead, it became the seed of endless suspicion. Its conclusions are still taught as fact, but for critics, it stands as evidence of something else entirely, that the truth may have been sacrificed for the sake of national stability. And that leaves us with unsettling questions. Was the commission ever seeking the whole truth, or simply protecting the country from the shock of what that truth might reveal? And if the foundation of the story is flawed, what does that mean for the entire narrative built on top of it? In any homicide investigation, especially the assassination of a head of state, the autopsy isn't just routine. It's the cornerstone, the foundation upon which every conclusion rests. Step by step, the rules are clear. Every wound is examined, photographed, measured. X-rays reveal what the eye cannot. The brain, the organs, preserved for study. Every note, every draft, every sketch, archived, never destroyed. The principle is simple. Nothing is missing. Nothing is altered. Nothing is left to chance. Because if a case goes to trial, this material isn't optional. It's the spine of justice itself. Protection against confusion, error, or worse, deliberate manipulation. That is what should have happened in the autopsy of President John F. Kennedy, but it didn't.
The autopsy was a complete botch. There was something like 120 people connected with it. It was run by the military. Most of the people involved in it were not really competent to do it. Many of the photographs and the x-rays, which are the record of the autopsy, have either been lost or burned, so only a part of the material is left.
Mr. Stone, if you could for a moment, you had mentioned earlier about some anomalies in the autopsy. Would you be able to speak to that? I have about 1 minute and 19 left.
One of the things that we did in our documentary, JFK Revisited in 2021, was show as much as we could about the autopsy, including the fact that there are 40 people still alive, as far as I know, who witnessed at Parkland and at Bethesda a large gaping wound in the back of President Kennedy's right head, indicating a shot from the front.
That on April 26, 1965, or approximately 1.5 years later, Admiral Berkeley, who had been the president's personal physician, sent over to the National Archives a chest filled with all the materials relevant to the autopsy and the president's death. In Admiral Berkeley's inventory, there are listed the brain, the microscopic autopsy slides, and the additional photographs, the color photographs of the interior of the president's chest. On November 1, 1966, about 1.5 years after Admiral Berkeley's inventory, with the materials incidentally never having left the National Archives as far as anybody can ascertain, in the second inventory, the brain, the slides, and the photographs are no longer there.
One of the most critical pieces of physical evidence, President Kennedy's brain, vanished from the official archives. After the autopsy, it was placed in a stainless steel container, first stored at Bethesda, then transferred to the National Archives in 1965. But by 1966, when an inventory was conducted, the container was gone. Its disappearance remains unexplained. Without the brain, the trajectory of the head wounds cannot be fully reconstructed. A fundamental forensic question, the path of the fatal shot, remains unresolved. The official record includes a set of autopsy photographs and X-rays, yet problems emerge immediately. Staff who were present at Bethesda later testified that the images in the archives did not match their recollections. Dr. Robert McClelland of Parkland observed that the photos did not depict the massive occipital defect he had seen on the back of Kennedy's head. Autopsy photographer John Stringer testified under oath that the images attributed to him were not taken with his usual film or techniques. X-rays, too, have been questioned. Some show fragments doctors never recalled, while others appear inconsistent with the written notes from the night of the autopsy. One image reveals what critics call the white patch, an area of unnatural brightness at the back of the skull. To some, it looks like an accidental artifact. To others, it suggests tampering, perhaps even an attempt to conceal the true extent of the head wound. Then there is the so-called 6.5mm object. On the frontal skull X-ray, it appears as a perfectly round fragment, exactly the diameter of the bullets fired by Oswald's rifle. And yet, strangely, it was never mentioned in the autopsy report, nor in the testimony of the doctors who performed it. These discrepancies suggest a stark reality. Either some photographs and X-rays are missing, or the surviving set has been altered or substituted. The very record meant to preserve the truth of Kennedy's final injuries is at best incomplete and at worst, manipulated. The uncertainty doesn't stop with photographs and X-rays. One of the most glaring lapses came from the autopsy notes themselves. Dr. James Humes, the chief pathologist at Bethesda, later admitted that he had burned his original autopsy notes in his fireplace at home. Humes claimed the notes were blood-stained and that he recopied them cleanly for the official report. But critics argue that this act destroyed the most authentic, contemporaneous documentation of Kennedy's wounds, the very evidence that could have settled lingering questions about trajectories, wound size, and entry versus exit points. Without the original notes, historians and forensic experts are forced to rely on a reconstructed record compiled from memory and secondary accounts. That reconstruction forms the backbone of the official story, but it is a record built on what was preserved, not necessarily what actually occurred. The burning of these notes, combined with missing photographs, X-rays, and the vanished brain, paints a troubling picture. The materials that should have anchored the truth of Kennedy's autopsy are incomplete, inconsistent, or entirely absent. And with every missing piece, the gaps in the record only grow, leaving the investigation vulnerable to doubt, speculation, and suspicion. The questions raised by missing notes, photographs, and the vanished brain are compounded by the way Kennedy's autopsy evidence was handled. Proper forensic protocol requires a strict chain of custody. Every piece of evidence documented at every step, every transfer logged, every handoff accounted for. In Kennedy's case, that chain was at best loose. Records on when the body and autopsy materials were received, transferred, or stored are inconsistent. Key items like the brain, bullet fragments, and original photographs simply disappeared or were unaccounted for during critical periods. There is no complete unbroken record showing who had access to these materials, when, and under what circumstances. The stretcher bullet, later labeled Commission Exhibit 399, was reportedly discovered at Parkland Hospital. Yet accounts differ. Some say it was found on a stretcher used by Governor Connolly, others on one used by Kennedy. The bullet passed through hospital staff, Secret Service agents, and eventually to the FBI with gaps in documentation along the way. Fragments removed from Kennedy's head at Bethesda were sealed in envelopes, but later the contents were either incomplete or missing entirely. At least one FBI agent, Francis O'Neill, later said that the fragments shown in the National Archives did not look like the same ones he saw placed into evidence that night. During the autopsy, small sections of tissue were preserved for microscopic study. But when later researchers examined the official record, some of these samples were missing from the collection. Other samples were logged, but later could not be located or verified. Each missing item, each conflicting account chips away at the reliability of the record. Instead of an unbroken line of evidence, what remains is a patchwork of objects that may or may not be the same as those originally collected. At Parkland Hospital in Dallas, doctors treating Kennedy described a small wound in the throat, one they initially interpreted as an entrance wound. They also recalled a large, gaping wound in the rear of the head. At Bethesda Naval Hospital, however, the official autopsy report described the throat wound as an exit, and the skull wound as being primarily on the top and right front of the head, not the rear. The Dallas doctors never had the chance to take precise measurements before Kennedy was pronounced dead, but Bethesda did, and their notes don't always align. The back wound was measured at different locations depending on which document is cited. In some diagrams, it sits lower on the back, in others, higher near the base of the neck. The measurements recorded in autopsy notes sometimes don't line up with what later official exhibits claim. The autopsy sketches, drawn under the supervision of Dr. Humes, show the back wound lower than where it appears in photographs now held in the National Archives. Witnesses who saw the autopsy photographs at later government reviews, including the House Select Committee on Assassinations, reported inconsistencies. Drawings placed the wounds in one location while photographs appeared to show something else. These contradictions between Dallas and Bethesda, between notes and measurements, between sketches and photographs, create a record that is not only incomplete, but internally at odds with itself. At Bethesda, the throat wound was not explored. Instead, it was described only after surgeons noted it had been obscured by the emergency tracheotomy in Dallas. By leaving it unexamined, the autopsy team left open the question, was it an entry or an exit? The brain, central to reconstructing the trajectory of bullets, was handled in only the most limited fashion. Records show no complete sectioning of the brain was ever performed, a basic step in determining bullet paths. Without it, any analysis of directionality and number of shots was compromised from the start. The Parkland doctors were the first to see Kennedy's wounds, unaltered by surgery or post-mortem handling, yet their observations were never formally included in the autopsy record. No Parkland physician was called to Bethesda, and their testimony was only gathered later in fragments under questioning. These omissions are not trivial mistakes. Each represents a fork in the road where critical evidence could have been clarified, but instead was left blank. How can history be written on a record full of holes? If the president's brain is missing, if his autopsy notes were burned, if photographs and x-rays cannot be verified, what confidence can we place in the conclusions drawn from them? And when the very body of the president yields two different stories, one told in Dallas, another in Bethesda, which one are we to believe? One of the most troubling threads in the autopsy controversy involves the people who were there, the doctors, nurses, and staff who saw President Kennedy's body with their own eyes. Their words were supposed to be the foundation of truth, yet over time, many of those words shifted. At Parkland Hospital in Dallas, several doctors initially described a large wound in the back of the head, consistent with a possible exit wound, yet later, some softened or revised their accounts to match the official autopsy conclusions. Immediately after the assassination, McClellan described a large avulsive wound of the right posterior skull, with brain tissue extruding. He later said he had a clear view of the back of Kennedy's head blown away. In his Warren Commission testimony in 1964, he repeated that the wound was in the right posterior portion of the head. Unlike most of his colleagues, McClellan never wavered. Even decades later, he maintained that the wound was at the rear of the skull, not the top, not the side. He remained one of the few who resisted the official version. Clark initially wrote that there was a large wound in the right occipital parietal region, noting that much of the brain was missing. This suggested trauma to the rear of the skull. But by the time he testified before the Warren Commission in 1964, his language had shifted. He still described a large wound, but now located in the right occipito-parietal region, a phrasing that could be interpreted as more toward the right side or top of the skull. His wording had become more flexible, more compatible with the Bethesda autopsy description. At the press conference on November 22, 1963, Perry described the throat wound as an entry wound, small, neat, and circular. To many reporters, this implied a shot from the front. But by the time he testified before the Warren Commission in 1964, his description had shifted. Perry explained that the wound could have been either an entrance or an exit, stressing that he had not examined it closely enough to be certain. What began as a definitive impression was softened into ambiguity, language that now aligned more comfortably with the Bethesda autopsy conclusion that the throat wound was an exit from a bullet fired from behind. In his notes from November 22, 1963, Carrico described a small wound in the throat and a large avulsive wound of the right occipital parietal area. The term occipital points clearly to the back of the skull. When he testified before the Warren Commission in 1964, Carrico repeated that the head injury was a fairly large wound in the right posterior quadrant of the skull. His description remained broadly consistent with a rear wound. Yet in later discussions, his wording left more room for interpretation, a shift that allowed the injury to be read as extending toward the right side or top of the head, in line with the Bethesda autopsy. Whether this was the result of reflection, new evidence, or outside influence remains hotly debated. At Bethesda, the confusion only deepened. Witnesses disagreed on when the casket arrived, what kind of casket it was, and even what condition Kennedy's body was in. Paul O'Connor, the autopsy technician, recalled that the back of Kennedy's skull was blown out, a massive defect in the rear of the head. But this description clashes with the official autopsy photographs, which show an apparently intact back of the skull. Gerald Custer, the X-ray technician on duty, remembered taking films that revealed extensive head fractures. Later, he insisted that the official X-rays in the record did not match what he had seen that night. Floyd Reeby, Bethesda's medical photographer, went further still. He claimed many of the autopsy photographs now preserved are not the ones he took, and that the wounds he remembered do not line up with the official images. Even Dr. James Humes, the chief pathologist, shifted in his descriptions. His early notes and testimony suggested one trajectory for the back wound, but later, under questioning, his conclusions adjusted to fit the single bullet theory promoted by the Warren Commission. Taken together, these contradictions deepen the mystery. If the wounds look different depending on who you ask, and if the photographs and X-rays themselves are disputed, then what exactly is the true medical record of President Kennedy's body? Several witnesses later suggested they felt intimidated or coerced, whether by military officers, Secret Service agents, or higher authorities. Some claimed their statements were altered, or that they were warned to keep quiet. At his November 22, 1963 press conference, Dr. Malcolm Perry described the small, neat wound in Kennedy's throat as an entrance wound, a statement that implied a shot from the front. Yet within days, after meetings with federal officials, his language began to change. He revised his description, calling it compatible with either an entrance or exit wound. Years later, colleagues recalled him admitting that he had felt pressure not to contradict the official autopsy conclusions. What began as a clear observation in Dallas had been reshaped into something far more cautious and far more convenient for the government's narrative.
Arriving at the emergency room, Dr. Carrico had placed a tube in the president's trachea to assist his breathing, but there was a neck wound anteriorly and a large wound of his head in the right posterior area.
In later years, Dr. Charles Crenshaw claimed that government agents pressured the Parkland doctors to stay quiet about what they had seen on November 22nd. His allegations painted a picture of intimidation, a warning to fall in line with the official story. Critics argue that Crenshaw exaggerated his role and embellished details over time, but his claims added fuel to the suspicion that silence was not voluntary, but enforced. Dr. James Humes later admitted that he burned his original autopsy notes in the fireplace at his home, explaining that they had been stained with the president's blood. To critics, this act was nothing short of shocking, destroying the very first draft of history. Many believe it wasn't about stains at all, but about pressure. The suspicion lingers that those notes may have contained details that contradicted the final, polished autopsy report. Years after the fact, Dr. J. Thornton Boswell acknowledged that the autopsy was not conducted in a normal medical setting. Instead, He described it as a military command environment where he and his colleagues followed orders from higher-ranking officers. The implication was clear. The doctors were not working with full independence, but under the authority and scrutiny of the military chain of command. Paul O'Connor later recalled that strict secrecy was imposed on everyone present at Bethesda. He said he was explicitly warned not to talk about what he witnessed, under threat of punishment. As he put it, "We were told we could be court-martialed if we ever revealed what we had witnessed." Gerald Custer, who took X-rays of President Kennedy's body at Bethesda, later said he was explicitly warned not to speak about what he had seen. He claimed he was told to keep quiet about the images and the circumstances surrounding them, an instruction he interpreted as a direct order from higher authorities, which leads to the inevitable unsettling question: were these witnesses lying then, or are they lying now? If their first impressions were true, the official story collapses. If their later testimony was honest, why the contradictions? And if fear shaped their words, then the historical record may have been manipulated at the very source. The shifting voices of these witnesses remain one of the most haunting aspects of the JFK autopsy debate, a reminder that even memory itself can become a battleground.
The findings of the Warren Commission on the assassination of President John F. Kennedy may now be disclosed to the public. Chapter 1 begins. The assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy on November 22, 1963, was a cruel and shocking act of violence directed against a man, a family, a nation, and against all mankind. In 300,000 words of lean and orderly language, the Warren Commission makes these major findings. Lee Harvey Oswald assassinated President Kennedy. He did it alone. He was not a part of any conspiracy, either domestic or foreign. In arriving at its findings, the Commission sharply criticizes...
The Warren Commission's final conclusion on the assassination of President Kennedy became, for its defenders, the definitive word. The official story meant to silence all doubt. Prominent figures like Arlen Specter, one of the Commission's young lawyers, stood firmly behind its findings. Specter became best known for formulating the single bullet theory. For him and for other Commission defenders, this theory tied together the loose ends. But critics saw the opposite. From the very beginning, journalists, researchers, and even some medical witnesses raised troubling questions. How could a single bullet cause such damage, yet emerge nearly pristine on a hospital stretcher? Why did early witness testimony about the direction of shots not align neatly with the official narrative?
Screening out the absurd and the irrational, we are left with a series of real and critical questions about the assassination. Questions which have not been answered to the satisfaction of the people of the United States.
As we take up whether or not America should believe the Warren report, we'll hear first from the man who, perhaps more than any other, is responsible for the question being asked. Mark Lane, lawyer and former New York State Assemblyman, was the gadfly of the Warren Commission. He demanded the right to appear before it as a defense counsel for the dead Lee Harvey Oswald. Refused, he began his own investigation of the president's death. A study that produced first the best-selling attack on the Warren Commission, Rush to Judgment, and now a movie of the same name.
Mark Lane, a young attorney from New York, became one of the first and most visible critics. In late 1963, only weeks after the assassination, Lane published an article in the National Guardian questioning whether Oswald had received a fair hearing in the court of public opinion. 2 years later, in 1966, his best-selling book, Rush to Judgment, laid out, piece by piece, the contradictions and omissions he believed the Commission had ignored, particularly eyewitness testimony that conflicted with the lone gunman theory. Lane argued the report was more about protecting institutions than uncovering the truth.
If he had lived, of course, he would be entitled to counsel. I think he is entitled to counsel now, and I think all of America now is entitled to have counsel for Lee Oswald so that we can find out actually what took place on November 22nd.
Harold Weisberg, a former Senate investigator, took a different but equally relentless path. Outraged by what he saw as selective use of evidence, he filed Freedom of Information lawsuits and poured through the Commission's 26 volumes of hearings and exhibits, His self-published 1965 book, Whitewash, accused the commission of deliberately obscuring the facts. Weisberg's style was less narrative and more prosecutorial, highlighting what he called evasions, distortions, and suppression inside the official record.
Now, in dealing with the suppressed evidence tonight, I'm going to be restricting myself, not entirely, but largely, to that evidence which is basic in a homicide investigation. Essentially, this is the medical evidence, and that includes the autopsy, and the president did not have a proper autopsy, as you will see. It includes the ballistics evidence and relevant scientific tests. One of the ways in which the commission suppressed evidence was just to avoid it. One of the ways of avoiding evidence was avoiding essential witnesses. The commission began with a preconception that there was a lone nut assassin. His name was Lee Harvey Oswald, and they cared about nothing else. The organization of their work in its earliest day, before they really began to function, was quite detailed. It's the first thing in the appendix of postmortem. And it is clear that the commission was determined to do what it could to lend credibility to their preconception of political nature that Oswald was the lone assassin.
Then there was Sylvia Mager, a quiet but meticulous researcher who worked as an indexer for the World Health Organization. In her spare time, she created a personal index of the Warren Commission's thousands of pages, an act of patience that few others could have endured. By 1967, she published Accessories After the Fact, where she laid out, with surgical precision, dozens of inconsistencies in the evidence and testimony. Her mastery of the record made her indispensable to other researchers. If someone wanted to find a buried contradiction in the Commission's volumes, they went to Sylvia Mager.
Now, I must say that reading these volumes, far from allaying these misgivings that, in common with many other people, I had felt greatly intensified them. I found not only contradictions which indicated carelessness, predisposition of the commission to certain findings, unfair tactics in the examination of witnesses. I found, as many other people have pointed out, that there were favorable witnesses. I'm using wrong terminology here. There were the witnesses that, friendly witnesses and hostile witnesses, which in itself is entirely inappropriate to any fact-finding investigation. You should not have friendly nor hostile witnesses.
Together, Lane, Weisberg, and Mager set the stage for what would become a decades-long battle. Ordinary citizens holding the government's official truth up to the light and finding the shadows impossible to ignore. The result was a sharp divide. On one side, government lawyers and officials insisting the evidence had been fairly weighed. On the other, a growing community of independent investigators, journalists, and ordinary citizens who felt the commission had failed to answer the most basic questions. Who fired the shots and from where? And why did the evidence seem to tell two different stories? What began as a few determined voices soon grew into a movement. The Warren Commission had been intended to reassure the American people, to put their doubts to rest. Instead, the work of critics like Lane, Weisberg, and Mager did the opposite. Their books circulated widely, reaching readers who had never questioned the official story before. Television programs debated their claims, newspapers reviewed their findings, and grassroots groups formed to re-examine the evidence themselves. The more people looked, the more they found reasons to doubt. The Commission's defenders dismissed these critics as misguided or politically motivated. But the critics had planted a seed. If a government investigation could be so sloppy or so selective about the death of a president, what else might it be hiding? By the mid-1970s, the Warren Commission's final word on the Kennedy assassination was anything but final. A decade of growing skepticism had transformed into outright public distrust. The assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy in 1968 had deepened the sense that political violence in America was neither random nor fully explained.
Larry, my question is a follow-up of what Steve just asked. Is it also complicated with the fact not only that Harvey Oswald was killed and did not go through trial and people did not see the evidence, but in a few years after that, there were other tragedies, one of them being the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And again, the accused and convicted assassin was a man who was without money and had been in and out of prison, and yet he was found getting a passport going through Canada to London, and money found in his pocket. So there were a lot of mysteries behind that. Do these overlap to create even more suspicion on the part of the American people?
Well, yes. There was really a decade from the early 60s to the early 70s where we had a series of political assassinations or attempts. Those including President Kennedy's, Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy, Malcolm X, George Wallace. And in some ways, they all had perhaps less than satisfactory explanations. And there was somewhat of a cumulative effect as far as the public having doubts that were simply reinforced by subsequent assassinations.
Then came Watergate. The revelations of government deception, secret surveillance, and political cover-ups shattered whatever faith many Americans still had in official accounts. If a sitting president could lie and manipulate the machinery of government, why should anyone believe that the truth had been told about the death of President Kennedy?
The thing that's so appalling to me is that the president, when this whole idea was suggested to him, didn't in righteous indignation rise up and say, "Get out of here, you're in the office of the President of the United States. How can you talk about blackmail and bribery and keeping witnesses silent?"
In mid-1971, the Pentagon Papers were leaked. That report proved that administrations from Truman to Johnson had intentionally expanded their Vietnam War efforts, in contrast to what the public was told. The Nixon administration then panicked and formed a covert group to halt leaks. Nixon advisor John Ehrlichman assembled the White House plumbers and included former CIA agent E. Howard Hunt and former FBI agent G. Gordon Liddy. Soon, the president's political rivals were recorded on Nixon's enemies list. Politicians, journalists, and even Hollywood actors Nixon feared could stop his re-election were included and were harassed by the administration with tax audits, legal action, and more.
In this climate of suspicion, Congress moved to act. In 1976, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, HSCA, was created to reinvestigate not only the death of John F. Kennedy, but also that of Martin Luther King Jr. It was a rare acknowledgement that the public's doubts could no longer be dismissed. For the first time, the U.S. government itself admitted, at least indirectly, that the Warren Commission's work had not put the matter to rest. The HSCA was meant to restore confidence. Instead, its very existence underscored how deep the mistrust had already become. When the House Select Committee on Assassinations released its final report in 1979, it stunned the nation. After 3 years of investigation, thousands of documents reviewed, and dozens of witnesses questioned, the committee concluded that President Kennedy was probably assassinated as a result of a conspiracy. It was a carefully worded sentence, probably, not certainly. But in that one line, the U.S. government had, for the first time, broken with the Warren Commission's most fundamental claim, that Lee Harvey Oswald acted entirely alone. The contradiction could not have been sharper. The Warren Commission had insisted there was no credible evidence of a conspiracy. The most controversial piece of evidence the HSCA examined came not from Dallas in 1963, but from a police motorcycle radio. On the day of the assassination, one Dallas officer's microphone appeared to have been stuck in the open position, inadvertently transmitting sounds from Dealey Plaza to police headquarters. That transmission was captured on a dictabelt recording, a thin plastic belt used at the time to log police communications. Years later, acoustic experts studied the recording. By analyzing the sharp spikes of noise, they argued they could identify the sound patterns of gunshots. Their conclusion: at least 4 shots had been fired in Dealey Plaza, not 3. And one of those shots, they said, came from the grassy knoll, a location inconsistent with Oswald's position in the Texas School Book Depository. If true, this meant a second gunman had fired at the president, shattering the lone assassin theory. The HSCA leaned heavily on this acoustic evidence in reaching its most startling conclusion that Kennedy was probably assassinated as a result of a conspiracy. But it also opened the door to even deeper conflict. How could one government investigation dismiss the possibility of conspiracy entirely, while another, more than a decade later, declared it likely? For many Americans, the damage was already done. If one investigation could declare the case closed, only for another to reopen it and hint at hidden forces, how could the public ever be sure of the truth? The HSCA didn't just rely on the dictabelt recording. It also went back to one of the most contested areas of the case: the medical testimony. They interviewed doctors from Parkland Hospital in Dallas, many of whom had originally described Kennedy's throat wound as an entry wound, suggesting a shot from the front, not the rear. They also revisited the accounts of Bethesda Naval Hospital witnesses where the autopsy had been performed. Their recollections often conflicted with the official autopsy report, raising more doubts about whether all the wounds had been accurately documented. The committee also scrutinized the autopsy photographs and x-rays long shielded from public view. Experts disagreed on what the images showed. Some said the photos supported the official version of events, while others found them incomplete or inconsistent with witness testimony. The mystery surrounding missing materials, notes, images, and even tissue samples only deepened the sense that the full story of the president's wounds had never been told. But even as the HSCA pushed further than the Warren Commission, it was hobbled by practical and political limits. Its budget and time were restricted, forcing investigators to cut corners and wrap up before all leads could be pursued. Worse, the committee had to rely heavily on the very agencies it was supposed to scrutinize, the FBI and CIA. Both had been accused of withholding documents and misleading earlier investigations. Now, once again, critics charged that these agencies filtered the flow of information, ensuring that some of the most sensitive files stayed out of reach. The HSCA had promised clarity. Instead, its re-examination raised new doubts, while its limitations left many Americans wondering, had the government truly tried to uncover the truth or simply manage it? When the HSCA released its report in 1979, many had hoped it would finally provide closure. Instead, it had the opposite effect. By declaring that President Kennedy was probably assassinated as a result of a conspiracy, the committee had cracked the foundation of the Warren Commission's lone gunman narrative. But it offered no definitive answer to the central questions. Who conspired? How? Why? The result was paradoxical. The U.S. government now had 2 official investigations with 2 different conclusions. One said Oswald acted entirely alone, the other said a conspiracy was likely. Both stood side by side in the record, neither erasing the other. For the public, this wasn't resolution, it was confirmation of their worst fears. If the government couldn't agree on the truth of its own president's murder, why should anyone trust it on anything else? Instead of healing the wound, the HSCA deepened it. What had started as doubt in 1964 had, by the late 1970s, hardened into a culture of mistrust that would shadow every future revelation. By the early 1990s, nearly 3 decades after President Kennedy's assassination, public trust in the official story had all but collapsed. The Warren Commission's conclusion that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone had been doubted since the day it was published, and the House Select Committee on Assassinations, though it went further, had only deepened the confusion by suggesting a probable conspiracy without naming who was behind it. The result was an open wound in American memory, one that refused to close. Then, in 1991, something unexpected reignited the fire. Oliver Stone's film JFK hit theaters, dramatizing the assassination as a vast government conspiracy. The movie was controversial, but it tapped directly into what millions of Americans already felt: that crucial truths had been buried, locked away in classified government vaults. Audiences left theaters not just entertained, but outraged. They demanded answers. They wanted to see the files for themselves.
3/4 of all Americans polled by the Gallup organization doubt the theory of the Warren Commission that one man killed President John F. Kennedy. 73% say others were involved. Our own poll, although small, confirmed those statistics. Of the moviegoers I talked with at the Westwood Town Center Theater, 4 people believed the conspiracy theory. 1 was unsure.
I came in believing that there was a conspiracy, and I think the movie only reinforced it.
Makes you wonder about the government, what they're doing to, find out what happened with John Kennedy.
I would say that there was definitely a second or third gunman, and that was definite.
I'm no expert, but I've seen the photographs, the drawings, the x-rays, and nothing seems to match. The x-rays don't match the pictures, don't match the drawings. We've got someone here. Maybe you can sort of comment. Anybody just jump in.
Under growing public pressure, talk began to shift from speculation to accountability. If the government had nothing to hide, why were so many assassination records still sealed decades later? That question, echoing from talk shows to Capitol Hill, forced Congress to act. In 1992, Congress made a rare admission that the truth, or at least the perception of it, had been lost. Public faith in government transparency had eroded so deeply that lawmakers could no longer ignore the pressure. The outrage following Oliver Stone's JFK had done what decades of journalism could not. It pushed Washington to open its vaults. That year, the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act, better known as the JFK Records Act, was signed into law. Its purpose was simple, but profound: to restore trust through transparency. For the first time, the government was legally required to collect, review, and publicly release every document related to the assassination, from the CIA, FBI, Secret Service, Pentagon, and any other agency that had touched the case. But Congress didn't leave that task to the same institutions accused of hiding the truth. Instead, it created an independent body, the Assassination Records Review Board, or ARRB, to oversee the process. The board's mandate was clear: find the hidden files, declassify them, and make them public. In theory, it was the final step toward full disclosure, a chance to lift the last veil over one of the most scrutinized murders in history. But in practice, it would reveal something far more complicated: that even when the government tries to tell the whole truth, some secrets refuse to die. Over the next 4 years, the ARB oversaw the release of millions of pages of documents. Many were mundane: travel logs, memos, and personnel files. But others peeled back layers of history, revealing how intelligence agencies monitored Lee Harvey Oswald, how evidence was handled after the assassination, and how officials debated the public narrative behind closed doors. Yet, despite its sweeping powers, the ARRB quickly ran into the same walls that had frustrated every previous investigation. Records were missing. Others were still heavily redacted. Some agencies delayed or disputed the board's requests, citing national security or protection of intelligence sources. The board's members, historians, archivists, and legal experts, pushed as far as their mandate would allow. But time, politics, and bureaucracy imposed their own limits. By the time the ARB's term ended in 1998, it had achieved a remarkable degree of openness, yet even then, not every secret had been released. The Assassination Records Review Board had the authority to demand files from every corner of the federal government, but it did not have unlimited power. Agencies could still appeal to one phrase that had haunted every investigation since 1963: national security. Invoking it became a familiar shield. The CIA, FBI, and Secret Service argued that some records contained sources, methods, or foreign intelligence details too sensitive to expose. Others simply dragged their feet, delaying cooperation until the ARB's legal mandate was nearly over. By the time the board's term expired in 1998, thousands of documents were still withheld, some fully classified, others heavily redacted beyond recognition. The promise of full disclosure had been met, technically, but not in spirit. What began as a mission of transparency ended with an unfinished story. The files that might tie the fragments together, the ones that could settle the question once and for all, remained locked behind government vaults. In the end, the Assassination Records Review Board achieved what no previous investigation had. It opened the vault. Millions of pages once locked away in government archives were finally brought into the light. For researchers, it was a revolution, a flood of new leads, names, and fragments that reshaped what we thought we knew. And yet clarity never came. The files often contradicted each other, reports that conflicted, witnesses who changed their stories, timelines that didn't align. Every new revelation seemed to raise two new questions. The deeper investigators looked, the more the narrative fractured. Decades after the last shot in Dealey Plaza, the mystery has only grown. The documents may be public, but the full truth remains elusive, buried beneath redactions, bureaucracy, and time itself. Because behind every open file, one question still lingers in the shadows. What's still hidden and why? When the Assassination Records Review Board closed its doors in 1998, it left behind both an archive and an unfinished promise. The JFK Records Act had set a firm deadline. By October 26, 2017, all assassination-related files were to be made public. No more delays, no more secrets. But when that date arrived, history repeated itself. President Donald Trump approved a partial release, tens of thousands of pages, yes, but held back others at the request of intelligence agencies. The justification was the same as always: national security. 5 years later, President Joe Biden followed the same path. More documents were declassified in 2022 and 2023, yet thousands of pages remain sealed. Official estimates suggest around 3,000 files are still classified, some fully, others with critical redactions that obscure their meaning. 60 years after the gunfire in Dealey Plaza, America still waits for the whole story. Each new disclosure brings fragments of clarity but never closure. The truth, it seems, remains just beyond reach, buried somewhere in the pages still marked secret.
What do you think?
Well, you know what I think. Presumably you've seen the movie, and the movie says quite clearly that his death was a coup d'etat. A lot of the facts in the case are still not agreed upon because various eyewitnesses differ in their accounts of it. There's no question that it is a full-out attack on the Warren Commission, because I don't believe it, and I think it was a lie. I think it was a lie put over on the American public that Oswald did it alone. We've had 28 years of bullshit from the government and from the media. Is it really a covert, a shadow government that runs America? Not only did they possibly kill Kennedy, but they killed Robert Kennedy, they killed Martin Luther King. They appointed Alan Dulles to investigate John Kennedy's death. That's like asking the fox to investigate the chicken coop. It isn't fair.
This is what we know for sure. On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was shot in Dealey Plaza, Dallas, an event witnessed by thousands and broadcast around the world. From the very first moments, the scene was one of chaos and confusion. Medical staff, law enforcement, and ordinary citizens were all processing trauma in real time, producing reports that often contradicted one another. Despite decades of investigations, hearings, and declassified files have filled shelves with thousands of pages of testimony, photographs, and reports, at the heart of the Kennedy assassination, the most basic questions remain unanswered. Where exactly was the fatal head wound? What precise path did the bullets take? And most importantly, who truly controlled the autopsy? These questions, unresolved after 60 years, mean the case never fully closes. Each missing piece, each contradiction, keeps the mystery alive, inviting new generations to dig through the evidence in search of answers that remain elusive. The autopsy, meant to be the definitive forensic record, should have resolved all doubt. Instead, it became one of the murkiest and most contested parts of the entire case. Secrecy orders silenced witnesses. Testimonies shifted over time. Key evidence was destroyed or went missing. Each revelation chipped away at public confidence, until millions came to believe not just that mistakes were made, but that something was being actively concealed. The result was more than a debate about Kennedy's death. It was a slow unraveling of faith in government itself. The institutions tasked with protecting the truth appeared, to many, to be guarding secrets instead. The unresolved questions of President Kennedy's autopsy did more than cloud a single case. They reshaped the American mindset. The sense that evidence had been hidden, altered, or destroyed planted the idea that official stories could not be taken at face value. Once that doubt took root, it spread far beyond Dallas. In the years that followed, each new scandal or national crisis was filtered through the same lens. Watergate confirmed for many that high officials could and did orchestrate elaborate cover-ups. Later, controversies around events like the Iran-Contra affair or even 9/11 were received with the same suspicion. People asked not just what happened, but what wasn't being told. In this way, the Kennedy autopsy controversy became the seed of a wider culture of conspiracy in America. It taught generations of citizens to question whether the official story is ever the whole story. If history can be rewritten in the morgue, if evidence can vanish in the nation's most important murder case, then what confidence can we place in the record of any crime, any event, any tragedy? The JFK assassination is no longer just the story of a fallen president. It becomes something larger, something darker, a test of truth itself.